This video includes a serious warning. In some YouTube videos and even in some watercolor books, you might see that they recommend this technique that I'm going to talk about today. But in reality, it's not even a watercolor technique, although we can find some uses for it like everything else. You can use it, for example, for kids to play and experiment. Or to create original lettering. To send secret love messages. To send subtle subliminal messages. Or even, if you're in a hurry, it can be useful for an illustration, but not for artistic watercolor. Not for artwork. I am Claudia Llobera, and if you're a wizard of watercolor, subscribe now by clicking the button, because you're on the best channel for artistic watercolor. Look, one day I posted this on Instagram. Remember that for the intense highlights on the sea, like in this case, it's better to leave the white of the paper. And just a subscriber asked me this very good question. And with white wax? And that's what I replied. You could also use it, but I'm not really in favor of it and I don't recommend it. It's much better to master this effect with the dry brush technique and let the highlights come from the texture of the rough paper, since the result is much more interesting aesthetically and is therefore considered a more professional finish. I have to make a video about this, and here I am making this video. Well, I'm asking for your patience because here I am editing the video, and some of you already know that this week I'm learning to edit with a new program and I'm working on it, so it's taking me a little longer. But look at how cool the interface is. Even this book talks about this wax technique just briefly. Do you see? Just apply the wax, then apply the watercolor on top. And voila, the magic. But then, in the part where it talks about creating highlights on the sea, do you see that it's this page? Here it recommends that we leave the white of the paper. It says that only the part related to the water will be painted. For this, a rough paper has been used that will allow its white to show through in the highlight areas. A wash is done with a mix of ultramarine blue, olive green, and burnt sienna, leaving the area where the moonlight reflects in white. You see here it says, the water has been painted with a wash of varying intensities, just barely touching the highlight areas with the brush. The roughness of the paper allows it to take on that speckled look. And nowhere on this page, it tells us that we could also create the highlights with wax. And by the way, a little curiosity, it tells us here that they are reflections at night. But let's see, these reflections and these bright whites of the sea, as we've already seen, can be found on a sunny day. That intense reflection of the sea produced by the sun's shine. I don't recommend using wax for several reasons. First, it's not a proper watercolor technique. It represents using a greasy technique like waxes. In fact, this is the reason why wax repels water, because of its oily content. You can tell that the stroke wasn't made with a brush, but with a pencil. And the strokes we can make end up looking very drawn and childish. Also, waxes are designed for children to use since they are non-toxic, don't stain, and don't break easily. 3. Once the wax is applied, there's no turning back. You can't correct it since it's impossible to completely remove the wax once it's applied to the paper. You see how in this example, even if we scratch, it still doesn't come off. 4. The result is very ugly compared to the dry brush technique. Well, here we have a stroke with wax on rough paper. Very interesting. As you can see, it doesn't turn out like that. Let's see if I press a little harder. I'm going to press. At least now it's showing a bit more. And now I'm going to make the stroke using the dry brush technique. I will take this one, which is going to work better for me. Do you see? I find it much more interesting. It shows us the roughness of the paper a bit wider, just as it is. This one looks like a more artificial roughness. And here I can keep highlighting my shines, for example, the highlights of the sea. And here, for example, I'm closing it up. And I'm making it smaller, for example. And now we have some highlights of the sea. The roughness, the shine, looks wider. And what I've told you, right? It looks more natural, more in line with what the roughness of the paper really is, right? That's the beauty of using good paper as well. Bring out its shape and its white. And on the other hand, with the wax, we don't get this effect. This example that I just showed you was done with a rough paper. The one I always use, which is the Arches brand, rough paper, to achieve this effect. So you can see the effect on each of the papers. I'm going to use a fine grain one now. We apply the wax. It's to compare the effect a bit. On fine grain, well look, it shows even less. I mean, worse than before. Well, the dry brush technique will also come out a bit less defined, but definitely more interesting. Do you see? A bit similar to what we had before. But since it's fine grain, it doesn't show as much, but it's much better than with the wax. And now let's see how it behaves with satin finish. If you've seen some of my videos, like the one about which is the best watercolor paper, then you already know that this satin finish is not very recommended for artistic watercolor. It would be for hyperrealism, illustration work, something more technical. But this paper is not at all suitable for artistic watercolor. Anyway, to experiment, let's see how the wax behaves again. Since this paper has no roughness at all, you can see this stroke I made quite well. Pretty straight and almost without any texture. Just the little puddles left here from the watercolor. Well, you already know. You know that here with the dry brush technique, we have nothing to do, right? This paper has no roughness, do you see? Nothing. What I told you at the beginning of the video, right? If you do illustration and always use this satin paper, well look, you could still take advantage of this technique, or maybe it's useful for more expressive artists. This paper doesn't work for us, okay? You already know we can't do the dry brush technique, nor can we work well with the wet on wet technique, which is quite important in watercolor because this paper dries faster and has no texture, etc. This is what I'm talking about, as I mentioned in the watercolor paper video. Now you're going to see an example in a real watercolor of how to create the highlights on the sea using the dry brush technique. Ultramarine blue lavender and a touch of cobalt turquoise. It broke with the mixture I already had. Let's create some central highlights. The sides, well defined, and in the center. Let's start with the dry brush. Be careful here, because we're working dry. I should have mixed in more color. Well, I'm gonna mix it now. So I'll do the vegetation over here. I'm taking more color. We darken. Let's close up these highlights a bit. Here we're going to add different tones now. Of the lake, on the sides a bit darker. I want to get rid of some white. Okay, I'm going to give it a try. Write me in the comments if you have ever used this wax technique, if you have tried it and what you thought of it. Would you use it again after watching this video? And if you haven't used or tried it, would you still dare to give it a shot? Have you been convinced by the dry brush technique? Isn't it better? Come on, tell me down below and I'll read you. And if you're feeling a bit lost now and aren't quite sure how to make the rest of the reserves in watercolor, I'm going to give you the ultimate solution. You're going to see this video right here immediately so you can learn the 5 methods for getting whites in watercolor. Everything is going to be crystal clear, just like the highlights of the sea. See you very soon!